Okay, great. I'm showing 2 minutes after the hour, and we have a nice amount of folks join. So I suggest we go ahead and get started. So in just a moment, we're going to kick off today's exciting webinar titled Beyond Federally Funded Buyouts, Local Policies, Tools, and Funding Streams. I just want to first say a little bit about our Managed Retreat conference. So my name is Radley Horton. I'm a climate scientist at Columbia University's Climate School, which hosts this once every 2 years conference on Managed Retreat. And we're really excited about the conference for this year. Today's session is really the first of two webinars before the conference officially starts next week. The conference, as many of you know, is centered around Managed Retreat. And this year we're pulling forward some themes that haven't been as prominent in prior years, especially around ideas of habitability, a somewhat loaded term that's getting more and more usage across communities, and also around mobility generally, and how that connects to the topic of Managed Retreat. So those themes you'll see more prominently than in past conferences, but you're also going to recognize a lot of themes that have been present when we had this conference in 2021 and 2019. So for example, that strong focus on environmental justice, and also on sort of practical issues related to implementation and sort of moving forward with action to address these complex problems. And certainly both of those themes will be very, very prominent in today's exciting discussion. So just to real quickly say a little bit more about the conference. The official conference kicks off next Tuesday afternoon with really the official start of the conference at 6 p.m. with a plenary. But we also are going to have a couple of in-person pre-event sessions Tuesday afternoon from 2 to 5. And people can find links to those if they'd like to join, as well as to the program as a whole on the link that's being provided right now in the chat. So, you know, we're really excited. Then we have the full program Wednesday all day, including evening, Thursday all day, and then we wrap on Friday at 3 p.m. And in general, it's going to vary, but it's mostly roughly 4 concurrent sessions going on, other than a couple times when we're going to be in plenaries. So there's clearly a lot of momentum, already over 400 people registered to attend in person, and over 100 people registered to attend online, and growing. And again, you'll see in the chat ways that you can still register if you haven't yet, if you'd like to. So that's going to be really exciting. But what's also going to be really exciting is the panel that we get to hear about right now. And with that, I'm thrilled to turn it over to Erica to start today's discussion. Thank you. I believe you're muted, Erica.
Okay, there we go. Yeah, so thank you, Radley, Adrian, and the Columbia team for having us today. And hello, everybody. My name is Erica Asinas, and I am a policy advisor with Urban Ocean Lab. So Urban Ocean Lab is a think tank focused on advancing equitable, practical, and ambitious ocean climate policy for U.S. coastal cities. And so for those of you attending the conference at Columbia next week, as Radley mentioned, you'll have the opportunity to engage in in-depth panel discussions around climate-driven displacement and efforts to advance the knowledge and practice of relocation around the world. But today in this free virtual webinar, we offer you a brief overview of the challenges related to using federal resources for relocation in the US, and also highlighting some of the efforts of local entities, including county governments, city governments, and nonprofits in addressing these challenges. With that, I'm so excited today to be joined by a panel of amazing experts, including Tim Troutman, who is the Flood Mitigation Program Manager for Charlotte-Mecklenburg Stormwater Services, Louise Young, the Chief Climate Officer of New York City's Office of the Comptroller, Brendan Shane, the Climate Director of the Trust for Public Land, and Johanna Lovecchio, who is the Funding and Resources Co-Chair of Climate Migration Network, and also the Associate Director of Program Design for Climate Action at Columbia's Climate School. So before we dive into their presentations, I'll provide a synthesis of some of the challenges and limitations of federal resources, and then turn the floor over to them. And as the presentations are ongoing, feel free to drop your questions in the chat, and we're going to have a Q&A session after the presentations. Okay, so with that, I will dive right in. And so, the conference is named, after Managed Retreat, and it's a term that is widely used, but just wanted to start off by saying that at Urban Ocean Lab, we use the term relocation because it most closely aligns with the policy landscape of relocation in the US, where our work is focused. We define climate-driven relocation as an adaptation strategy involving the movement of people, homes, and infrastructure away from climate-vulnerable locations and into receiving areas either further inland or at higher elevations. And when we talk about relocation, this involves multiple parts. So first is property acquisition, so physically moving structures and people out of harm's way. There's also the restoration and management of vacated land to increase flood protection, ecosystem restoration, and access to open space and other public amenities, and also rehousing and resettlement. So ensuring that people find safe, affordable homes and that they have the resources they need to thrive in their new communities. Throughout the entire process, communities must be provided with the support to ensure their psychological, emotional, and financial well-being, and also ensure cultural preservation, social inclusion, and racial and economic justice throughout. Today, we're talking about buyouts, and that is just one tool that helps facilitate the property acquisition aspect of relocation, though it's the most widely used and studied in the US. Governments purchase properties that have been substantially damaged to reduce future losses, and buyout programs can be funded with a variety of public or private sources, although most local governments rely on these competitive federal grants. So the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which is FEMA, and the Department of Housing and Urban Development and HUD offer the most widely used federal grants for buyouts and acquisitions. And while the decision to pursue buyouts can be initiated by communities, administering buyout programs is typically the responsibility of local governments. And buyouts, they will continue to be critically important in supporting relocation in the US, but using federal resources to administer them comes with limitations and challenges. So what are some of these limitations? So the first is scale. The available funding is limited and insufficient to meet the scale of relocation assistance needed both today and in the future. So FEMA has acquired over 43,000 homes, which is about 75% of all federally funded buyouts. And that is just a fraction of the 14.5 million homes impacted by climate catastrophes in 2021. And by 2100, we are expected to see nearly 5 million people, up to 13 million people that could be displaced by sea level rise alone. So the amount of funding for relocation needs to increase significantly to meet this growing need and demand. Another issue is the speed in which these federal resources become available. So federally funded buyouts take 2 to 10 years to complete from when a disaster occurs to the completion of a program. For FEMA buyouts, it takes on average 5 years or so. And by comparison, if local programs already have funding in place, it can take as little as 3 to 12 months to administer. So the duration of the buyout process and in which these funds become available is really important because it determines how long people, especially those who have limited resources for alternative housing, could be displaced. And the longer that the time passes after a disaster, the lower participation rates for buyout programs become. People might just choose to stay and rebuild in risky areas throughout that time. By design, another issue is that these federal resources focus on recovery and typically only become available after a presidentially declared disaster. So this limits relocation or buyouts as a response to extreme weather events rather than chronic impacts like sea level rise or compounding impacts like extreme rainfall combined with coastal flooding. While buyouts are mostly voluntary, the available adaptation options can diminish significantly when relocation is solely pursued in the aftermath of a disaster and communities have fewer opportunities to exercise agency. So, for example, homeowners can find themselves trapped in risky areas and not being able to sell their homes because of extensive damage or lower property values following a hurricane or flood. Another issue is access and equity. So not everyone will receive equal access to the federal resources available for buyouts and relocation. So federal resources are distributed through competitive grants. So wealthier counties who have the money, the time, the technical expertise, and capacity to navigate these lengthy, complex bureaucratic processes tend to win these grants. There's also a cost share requirement that comes with them. So for FEMA, they typically provide 75% and require 25% from non-federal resources, which can disincentivize smaller communities. For some programs, the local match requirement can be reduced for lower income communities, but funding for this is also really limited. And then in terms of eligibility for these grants, by law, non-US citizens don't qualify for federal aid, and homes without flood insurance and homes with upside down mortgages also don't qualify. So that could mean that people who need that assistance most may not actually qualify for these federal programs. And then even those who receive resources can encounter equity and implementation challenges when applying these funds. So with limited funding, there's often complex decisions to be made about who gets a buyout. And while wealthier counties are more likely to secure those federal grants, the properties that are actually bought out tend to be in areas with lower education levels, lower English language proficiency, and greater racial diversity. And then finally, by nature, the focus of buyouts is on property acquisition, and there's often limited funding for what comes next, such as rehousing or ecosystem restoration on vacated land. In terms of rehousing, homeowners typically get the pre-disaster value of their homes, and in some cases, renters impacted by buyouts are provided financial assistance through moving costs and rental payments for about a year or so. But relocating people who were previously living in a floodplain and who have limited socioeconomic resources can have difficulty in finding comparable housing in other more expensive areas outside of the floodplain. So the study of post-Sandy buyouts found that 99% of buyout participants relocated to areas with higher social vulnerability and 20% to areas with exposure to coastal flood hazards. In terms of restoration, buyout programs generally do not include funding for the future design, maintenance, or use of bought out land. And so this can result in blight or neglect, and also just a missed opportunity to advance the potential resilience benefits of relocation. So there was a study that found that buyouts from 1990 to 2000, only 7.5% of those bought out properties were actually restored to flood buffering ecosystems. And finally, the process of relocation itself can reduce local income from property taxes, which can be a challenge for local entities. And so federal resources will continue to be important, and we've seen progress in the last 2 years through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, Inflation Reduction Act, and Justice 40. We've seen increased appropriation for buyouts and also increased funding for other aspects of relocation like housing, infrastructure, and ecosystem restoration. There's more federal dollars available for climate action now than there has ever been, but we simultaneously know that it's not enough. It can come too late, and it can also be difficult to access. And so local funding streams can help close those gaps and address the limitations of federal resources, right? So they can help deliver quicker, more proactive and ongoing relocation programs, which we'll hear about from Tim and Charlotte Mecklenburg's buyout program, which is funded by stormwater service fees. They can also help deliver expanded services that aren't limited to single family homes and are tailored to community needs and priorities. And Johanna will be speaking about Climate Migration Network's work on participatory grant making and working with communities to do that. And finally, they can support more comprehensive support for all aspects of relocation and not just acquisition. So Louise will talk about New York City's municipal priorities, that include relocation, but also affordable housing and sustaining property tax revenues. And Brendan will talk about how ballot measures can advance conservation and adaptation efforts. So with that, I'm so excited to join these amazing panelists in conversation, and I will hand this over to Tim.
I think you're muted, Tim.
Okay. Huh. I must remute you when you share your screen. So anyway, thank you, everyone. I appreciate you having me. My name, again, is Tim Troutman. I'm an engineer and a certified floodplain manager, and I lead our engineering and mitigation program in Charlotte, North Carolina, that is embedded within our stormwater utility. So here's just a general area. We are not along the coast, but certainly deal with similar issues, many similar issues related to flooding that coastal communities do. There you can see Mecklenburg County on the map. And I did want to share this to provide context, because everything that we are doing within for buyout specifically is in the context of a stormwater utility. And our main two goals in the stormwater utility are protecting life and property, which is flood-related activities, and restoring natural floodplain functions, which are water quality kind of initiatives. And we do manage both of those within the stormwater utility. In Charlotte specifically, we have our flooding challenges are typically urban flash flooding. We don't have a large river system like the Mississippi River or Missouri River that run through the middle of downtown. We have very flashy streams that a lot of rain falls in a certain part of town and water rises very quickly. And so that does affect some of the mitigation solutions when you don't have a lot of lead time to react and get people out of harm's way. So this is generally what our flood mitigation program looks like now, and it's evolved over time. And it fits really well with this conversation. We began our buyout program relying exclusively on FEMA grants. As you can see, in 1999 is when we said we need to start doing things differently, and we need to buy and relocate people out of these floodplain areas where we basically need to let these areas continue to flood. They're intended to store flood water during large events, and they have lots of other benefits to the community. That evolved into us setting aside and doing a quick buy program as well. So we have a set aside that we call the rainy day fund, which is a reserve fund that is intended specifically to have reserve funding to potentially buy properties after a flood event occurs and there's damage that has been sustained. The third piece in 2012 is we realized many of the flaws that have already been mentioned with the federal programs, the timelines and benefit cost requirements. And so we decided that we needed to start locally funding some of our buyouts in addition to relying on federal grants. And we set up a 100% local buyout program in 2012. And then the fourth piece, which I'm not going to cover today because it doesn't have to do with buyouts, but we set up a grant program for property owners related to retrofitting houses and giving local grants for elevation, relocating mechanical equipment, putting in flood vents and things like that that reduce the risk, but they're in-place solutions. So that's essentially what our local program looks like. As we've discussed the benefits of mitigation and specifically of the relocation type projects like buyouts are there's less tax money spent at the end of the day on emergency rescues, disaster relief, temporary housing that needs to be provided during the recovery process, and flood insurance claims, because our national flood insurance program is backed by our tax dollars at the end of the day, and it's in debt. So there is tax money that even goes into the National Flood Insurance Program. At the end of the day, we're looking to have a safer housing stock, and relocation is a great term for us because we're looking to, over time, evolve our housing stock in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg area to shrink the housing stock in high-risk areas like floodplains. And it can grow. Fortunately, we do have space in Charlotte and a lot of growth to build new housing stock, or the private sector would build new housing stock in safer areas. And of course, one of the big benefits for us is it also increases opportunities for recreation and open space and water quality type of investments. One thing I wanted to highlight before I gave two quick examples is that we actually track our buyout program, both the investment and the return on investment over time. And this is a really powerful tool to gain support for these kind of local buyout initiatives. And here you can see, beginning back in fiscal year 2000, when we began buyouts, what our investment was, which is the darker blue color. And to date, we've invested over $71 million in the buyouts. And then we actually track in the lighter blue color the actual losses avoided from actual real flood events that have occurred. And we estimate what the damages would have been, and therefore the losses that were actually avoided. And we're already up to $32 million in actual losses avoided. So if we stop today with buyouts, that $32 million number would continue to grow every flood event we had that didn't have damages, and the $71 million number would stay the same. So eventually, certainly the return on investment will become positive for us. And this is a really powerful tool to communicate to city, county managers and elected officials. So I want to give two quick examples of our risk reduction in action that show how these programs that we have locally work. One is a larger example that did rely on federal funding, but just shows kind of the magnitude and some of the other benefits that we get from buyouts. And the other is a locally funded example with a quick turnaround. So this occurred, you can see in the photograph here, this is about a 10 to 15-year-old example where we had a significant challenge. We had two apartment complexes. The creek is right in the middle of those apartment complexes. You can kind of see the tree line that's on the top of the creek bank. And this was a very challenging situation where, there was a lot of flood damage, but specifically from an emergency response standpoint, this became a significant challenge for our community. If you picture 400 apartment units, 400 vehicles, and our fire and police department has 15 minutes to get everyone out of there because the creek is rising. It's not possible in a lot of cases. And so this became a high priority for us. And ultimately, after many, many years of work, 5, 6, 7, 8 years of work, we were able to secure a couple of FEMA grants very creatively and fund a buyout of one entire complex and a partial buyout of another complex on the other side. Here you can see on the left an immediate after picture once we just demolished and cleared the land. And then on the right side is a more recent aerial photograph. I'm sorry, I don't have the same vantage point of like a 3D helicopter view of what it looks like a few months ago. You can see the creek again down the middle. We actually invested in an environmental restoration project out here and built a stormwater pond and some wetlands, put in some walking trails, gravel or dirt type walking trails, and created what we call an ecological sanctuary on the property. That's been quite an amenity. The second example is just an individual example, and this is from about 9 months ago. Here you can see actually a rain map of Charlotte. We have rain gauges throughout our community, and you see an example here of our urban flash flooding. One part of town had 6.22 inches of rain that fell, and another part of town that I have circled was less than an inch of rain that fell. And you can imagine that kind of variation creates challenges for us in terms of knowing what's going to flood when rain is in the forecast. But this is what happened. We actually had, fortunately, just a couple homes that flooded. Here you can see one that ultimately we bought. Long story short, the owner had just bought the home about 4 months in advance, had put some work into the area, and this big event came and did about $50,000 in damage. And so at the end of the day, what we decided, we looked at our ultimate planning tools and our risk reduction recommendations. And this particular property was recommended for ultimately a buyout, even though it wasn't on the top of our radar. And so we were able to go in within a few weeks after the flood. We offered to buy the home for what the owner had paid for it, minus the $50,000 in damage. And therefore we purchased the home, and there's the lot itself. In this particular image, we purchased the home in a damaged condition, which resulted in a lower purchase price for us. The owner fortunately did have flood insurance, and so they were able to get the proceeds from the flood insurance and not make repairs, and kind of get out of the situation. So the one main takeaway that I just want to leave with folks is buyouts are an adaptation strategy that works. It's not suited for all locations, and you do have to adapt the strategy when issues like tax base and things are a concern, but they certainly are a viable option and a needed part of a larger strategy of dealing with water and the increasing amount of water that we have in our country.
Great. And thank you so much, Tim. And I see one question in the chat for you, but I'm going to save that for later. And just a reminder that if you have questions, add them to the chat, and we'll be doing the Q&A after the session. I'm now going to hand it over to Louise.
Great. Thank you, Erica. And thank you, Tim. That was such a great overview. New York City, unlike the work that Tim was talking about, we don't have a local buyout program in the same way, although there has been one proposed in our recent citywide sustainability plan. And so I think this is a really great opportunity for especially those who are New Yorkers on the call to think about, what kinds of things you would want to see in such a plan as the city thinks about program design and all of the mechanisms for how it should work. I wanted to start a little bit with the role of the Comptroller's Office, which is a bit of a funny spot sometimes to house climate work. I'm the Chief Climate Officer at the New York City Comptroller's Office. We take a long-term view of risk management, and that, of course, includes all of the climate risks that we have already been facing and that we will increasingly see more of. So we have kind of a couple of pillars of our work around a just transition to a low carbon economy, making sure that our communities are more prepared and resilient to the impacts of climate change, and through all of this, centering environmental justice communities who are faced on the front lines. I also wanted to ground us in the actual risks that we are looking to see in the future. By the end of the century, we may see 6 feet of sea level rise along our shorelines, which is a huge amount, 15 times increase in hurricanes like Hurricane Sandy, 25% more heavy rainfalls, and 4 times the days of heat waves above 90 degrees. And as many of you know, a lot of the efforts around New York City resiliency really picked up after the devastating impacts of Hurricane Sandy. And I wanted to kind of talk through a couple of different flooding risks that we face here, and also just ground us in like what is actually at risk that we have to think about from a climate relocation and resiliency policy standpoint. So these are, this is the map of our coastal flooding areas. The darker blue is the current 100-year floodplain, and as it gets lighter on, that's what it will look like in the future as the floodplain expands. And so you can see a majority of our transportation, parks and open space, and about half of our industrial uses are currently in the floodplain, in addition to 17% of our public housing and $176 billion of market value of real estate. And I should mention that this is already a 44% increase in real estate value since Hurricane Sandy. New York City, like many other coastal cities, has really been putting a lot of new development on the waterfront. And that's something that we will really need to contend with as we think about what that long-term viability of these coastal communities should look like. Tim was mentioning a bit about tax base, and that is something that, you know, we have to think about of what are the impacts to the city's balance sheet. And it's not so straightforward, right? Like there's a $2 billion of annual property tax roll in the floodplain now, but that's also coming out of the city's budget as we have to pay for damages and other kinds of responses as these events impact our communities. And then this is just a look at how much this is actually jumping as climate change intensifies through the middle of the century. And the one thing I want to point out, so you can see all the numbers go up, and in particular, that market value of real estate in the floodplain goes up by 38%, which is quite a lot. And so I think this is more just highlighting some of the tensions that many cities, including New York, are really grappling with. We also have a lot of different kinds of flooding, including chronic sunny day flooding. And as Eric issues are a lot harder to push forward for buyout programs or relocation programs because of the various ways that federal funding streams are set up, and because of the various ways that benefit cost analyses tend to push us towards certain kinds of hazards. Currently, there are almost 100,000 residents in New York who live in the tidal inundation zone, or in census tracts that are affected by tidal inundation, I should say. And of the affected areas, 60% of our affected buildings are in Queens, which is not a surprise given that Queens has the largest waterfront and is very low-lying, especially in Jamaica Bay. And as sea level rises throughout the decades, this number could jump really high. It could be about 7% of New York City's population, with about 128,000 residents affected. And the impacts in Queens are a lot more pronounced, where of all of the affected buildings by tidal inundation, we're seeing that the vast majority are in Queens here. And of course, in 2021, we also faced a different kind of flooding, again, a never experienced before in New York City to that scale and severity, where we had a lot of flash flooding from heavy rainfalls from the remnants of Hurricane Ida that really tragically trapped many people in basement apartment units and prevented them from egress to get outside. And so this is a new type of disaster, and a lot of the areas also correlate with many historic waterways and creeks and places that want to be water. And so in particular, our office did an analysis of the basement apartments in the city and the places where basement apartments intersected with the stormwater flooding areas. So you can see that in a moderate stormwater flooding scenario for New York, there's about 23,000 basement units, and that number jumps significantly as you look at more extreme stormwater scenarios that again can be a bit harder to access federal relocation or buyout funding for, because of the nature of this kind of hazard, and also the physical location that is not actually tied to the floodplain at all. You see many of the impacted areas by stormwater are inland, and so many of these places are not areas where residents have flood insurance and had not really thought of themselves as being flood vulnerable prior to 2021. And so thinking all about this by 2050s, and I really want to give credit here to Alex Miller, who I see on the call, and I'm so glad that he's here for some of this basic research. By 2050, we will have 800,000 New Yorkers, including 475,000 renters, 500,000 homes, and 67,000 public housing units that are in the floodplain. This is a whole lot of people and a whole lot of buildings, and it's not going to be an easy thing to relocate them all, and that's not even necessarily the right endpoint for many of these areas necessarily. And so, where does that bring us? I want to give also a shout out to Rebuild by Design, who did a wonderful climate displacement report, looking at the areas of New York City across a matrix of income and flood risk, and the areas that you see in lighter purple are low income, low flood risk. The blue is high income, low flood risk. And then when you get to the crisis areas, you have high income, high flood risk, which are likely folks who, people who can move themselves without significant supports. And then the areas in red, which are areas of highest concern, where you've got low income communities intersecting with high flood risk areas. And again, this is focused on the coastal floodplain. So again, there are other hazards here that we do also want to be thinking about in a thoughtful climate relocation program or policy. And so I just wanted to kind of prompt some of the different challenges or tensions in the city's responses to date, and also thinking ahead to what this voluntary buyout program that the city has committed to do should be considering. I think for a basic starting point, there hasn't really been such clear alignment between citywide resiliency planning and the many different kinds of ways that the city is taking climate action, from building coastal flood protection infrastructure to thinking about buyouts to rebuilding after damages happen. And I think that there's a real need to ground our citywide approach, our climate approach, in a risk-based framework to make decisions that can be really difficult about long-term future of at-risk neighborhoods. I'll give you a couple of examples, or at least one example where this tension really comes to the forefront, actually two. One is in Staten Island, there is an Army Corps-led project to build a new levee along 4.5 miles of the South Shore. And the federally funded buyout program after Sandy is right behind that. And I think that's a really challenging message. Is this an area we're protecting? Is this an area that you should retreat from? And is it somehow both? And if so, how do we kind of reconcile that messaging to somebody who's living in that neighborhood and thinking, what should I be doing? Should I buy a home here? Should I leave here? My mortgage is going to be, ending in the 2050s. How do I think about my housing safety and security? Another example that I'll give here is after Sandy, so many areas, particularly in the Rockaways, were really damaged, and there was a lot of effort to rebuild. For those who are New Yorkers, one of those hardest hit areas was Broad Channel. The city spent hundreds of millions of dollars rebuilding to higher elevations and new standards the neighborhood's street grid and sewer system that just was decimated by the storm. And then a couple of years later, the city also designated that area as a in their coastal zone overlay to limit new developments and density. That is, again, a mixed message that you're sending as a city of, should you stay here? Should you go? And I think there is, and I don't want to dismiss the real tension between what is the city's obligation to provide public services and a good level of infrastructure to current residents while thinking about the future. It is a real tension. And so, there's many smart and super dedicated people, and I put myself in that category, who were working on those projects. It's not an easy decision, but these are some of the things where if we don't kind of ground our actions in that kind of holistic policy, you do get some mixed messages, and that can be really tough. There was also really historic legislation passed at the state to disclose flood risks for rentals, but it excluded home sales. And so I think that there's a really big question about what is our obligation, or what obligation should we put on the real estate industry for flood disclosure, and how do we actually make known some of these risks in a way where people can make informed decisions about where they opt to live, no matter whether they're a homeowner or a tenant. And so all of this is to say, there's a lot of opportunity to be shaping New York City's voluntary buyout program that was announced in Plan YC, in our sustainability plan, that just was released in April. I think there's a lot of work to be done for those of us who are working in New York. I know Eric is going to get to some other, group questions, and there might be others in the chat. But I just wanted to end with, some things that we've been talking about that should be centered in a climate relocation program that really echoes some of the things that Erica was highlighting as challenges. I think it's really important to center community self-determination. Forced relocation has been shown not to work, and it's really challenging to tell someone they have to leave a home that they're and a community that they're part of. And so how do we embed that value of community self-determination in anything that we put forward? This kind of echoes what I already talked about, so I won't go into it, but how do we ground this in science-based, risk-based decision-making? I mean, we have to be driven by that as climate scientists are continuously adjusting their models and analysis for what climate projections will look like. I think there's two parts of needing to facilitate access to safe and affordable housing for those who are in lower lying at-risk areas, while also taking care not to exacerbate displacement and affordability of higher ground climate safe areas. We've already been seeing in lots of parts of Miami, real estate speculation that's really gone rampant, and how does that intersect with the affordable housing crisis that many cities are facing, and that is definitely the case here in New York City. And so we have to have housing policies that really acknowledge where some of those land values may shift over time as the climate changes. And then to diverse and sustained funding sources, I think there's going to be a lot more discussion there, but I'd love to Tim mentioned BCAs, and I have a lot of thoughts about how they really push us towards certain kinds of solutions, and also investments in certain kind of places. And so I think that that's one thing to consider as we are looking at ways to diversify long-term funding sources, is like, how are we not just continuing to value the places that we have already historically valued, and not undermining the places that cities and governments have historically disinvested in or underinvested in, from redlining and other forms of discrimination that really affect communities of color and Black and Brown residents. And so I think that as we're putting together that funding package for ourselves, those are things that I would urge us to consider as we are building that future together. So I'm going to stop sharing and hand it to the next.
Thank you so much, Louise. And I'm holding questions for the end, but I also just wanted to share Waterfront Alliance just commented in the chat that the New York State Legislature successfully passed flood disclosure for home buyers at the end of the session last Friday. So now pending the governor's signature. Yay. Okay, and I will now pass this on to Brendan Shane from Trust for Public Land.
Thanks, Erica. Let me share. Yeah, it's really great to be here. Appreciate Climate School and the Urban Ocean Lab. I'm going to pick up on a few of the themes that have been mentioned. Actually, Tim, spoke specifically to sort of the ability to use parks, community assets. Louise did as well. New York City's doing a lot of that. And so as you look sort of beyond federal buyouts, I wanted to focus in on, potentially the opportunity that parks, park planning, amenities, schoolyards, public lands that provide an opportunity to improve health, community wellness, long-term prosperity, really can be an important part of an otherwise really challenging conversation, right? So raising up conservation in parks as an opportunity to build community assets while addressing relocation and retreat issues. Just quickly, Trust for Public Land, we're in the business of creating parks, trail systems, parks of all sizes, national to local. I was going to do just a little tour to start off here with, sort of moving west to east. A lot of the parks we focus on are coastal. So, from Hawaii, Southern California. So many of you will be familiar. You can see the relocation issues in these pictures, right? The ones that are present today or that are coming up to the Northwest coast, Texas coast, cities and shorelines in Southeast Florida, all along the Mid-Atlantic, Chesapeake. Obviously, a lot of discussion already of New York and New Jersey. In New York, playgrounds that we work on that are now actually integrated with the program Louise is talking about. So looking at where there's extreme flooding, where those where people were losing their lives because of inland flooding, bringing parks that can manage severe stormwater and extreme weather to those areas. Many of these, these are affecting communities of all kinds. Some are smaller communities, but also larger, dense and urban communities, New York, up to Bridgeport, Connecticut. These are all parks that, I would say most of these parks you're looking at were not built with relocation, sea level rise, or other things in mind, right? They were built for other reasons, but they highlight the opportunity that when you bring parks planning, city master planning, conservation together with a look forward at the climate risks we face, there's an opportunity for synergies. We don't have enough money for managed retreat. We don't also have enough money for conservation and parks that people deserve for healthier communities. But together, as well as other funds I'll try to mention, you get closer. That when you're, if you're pushing for multiple benefits from every project, that when you have to address the managed retreat situation, if you're able to address, able to accomplish, other important community goals like creating public spaces and green space, you can, maximize the benefits and leverage that funding. I end with this one in Newark, just because this is not a retreat option, but this is a wonderful riverfront park for those of you who've been in Newark. It's immediately adjacent to Ironbound neighborhoods and others that flooded in Sandy. So this is post-Sandy. This is a riverfront park. Some of it is hardened because of historic contamination, the whole range of EJ issues in communities like this. But you'll see that to the left, that this is a bermed park. So this is the park built along the coastline at 500-year flood levels. In this case, protecting, right? Not necessarily retreating. We're trying to protect these longstanding communities, but clearly a nexus of parks and public spaces with adapting to climate. So at TPL, we did a report last year, and in general, I sit on a team that's trying to look at the power of parks to address climate change, and that may be sucking carbon out of the air into 250,000 acres of Montana or something like that. But it's very often for us, this is community-based, right? So this is increasingly focusing on climate resilience. So how can parks, trail systems, schoolyard systems can become climate action for communities? The questions, the relation to managed retreat are new for us, right? These are emerging, and they're emerging sort of all over the place for our teams that are coastal, clearly, but some, maybe more like Tim's team, and more inland cities facing serious shoreline and river flooding. So the opportunity, I use this word easing here cautiously, or I should qualify, right? It's not easy you don't ease many of the issues of managed retreat and relocation. But ideally, with a shift in the way we focus, the shift in planning, policy, and funding, you can bring folks together and identify common ground in a larger process of addressing climate threats and the need for relocation. So risk management drives much of this, but there's an opportunity to really, I think, move beyond that and focus on what comes next. So that recreation, health opportunities, biodiversity, wildlife, community cohesion, that as people move within a community, there are these new assets that bring them back together, that maintain culture and community that was there before, as well as, very importantly, economic development. When I first joined TPL a few years ago, presentation from New York State just sort of highlighted the fact that the outdoor recreation economy, you all know, is huge, right? But at that point, even 5 years ago, outdoor recreation in New York State had passed agriculture as a share of the state's economy. So you have huge economies around growing around outdoor recreation. And so the economic development potential as a counterbalance to the pain and the financial hit of relocation is a real thing. So the opportunity here, again, to sort of bring parks, but more generally, it's different everywhere. Community master planning, PUD development, bring the idea of public space together with risk management to more proactively prepare for relocation. Another reason to do this is tapping political and financial support. So conservation and parks are popular. We love this work in part because other people love this work. So you see federal conservation funding. So this is separate from buyouts and other emergency focused funding, growing considerably in recent years. The historic funding of what's called the Land and Water Conservation Fund, signed by President Trump with a huge bipartisan majority during the Trump administration. Now you see more money flowing in through the bipartisan infrastructure law and IRA. So from the federal level, important, you see recognition of this bipartisan nature. And then we do a lot of work at the state and local level. So TPL's conservation finance team has run more than 600 finance measures, state, county, local levels, generated $93 billion or it will. It's not all created already, but it has authorized and created the potential for this funding into the future. And these pass at a rate of 83%. And that is New York State, sort of more blue states, but this is the state of Georgia, statewide in Texas, counties and cities in Montana, red and blue communities, purple communities all over the country. And so the opportunity to, and one thing I'll just highlight here, you're starting to see what would have 10 years ago been a parks measure only. You start to see parks, resilience, climate, maybe not with just those words, maybe with other language that is locally appropriate coming into those measures. Oops, sorry, I'm going to just go back quickly. I think we will share these slides, but the landvote.org and conservationalmanac.org are two sites that TPL maintains that can help you link to where are these funding sources in every community. Just to dig in a little bit more from the Conservation Almanac and to highlight that there are significant pots of funding flowing to conservation that can be leveraged. And you see states, counties, local governments using these tools. So TPL's team will also often be in a business of saying, well, we can advance this park project in a high-risk area, whether it's post-disaster or not, maybe it's pre-planning, by pulling from certain federal pots, certain state pots, certain local pots. And one thing I'll just highlight here is that people often have a sense, perhaps, that the federal funding is where the money is. Not really. Conservation funding at the federal level has grown. So Land and Water Conservation Fund at Department of Agriculture, which includes a great program called Outdoor Recreation Legacy, focused on urban and community settings. NIFWIF, coastal resilience, but then a whole, other regional funds, Great Lakes funds, Delaware program funds, NOAA's new IRA-funded climate resilience challenge. They all add up to be very significant, but state funds, as you'll see here, are greater, and local funds are almost equal to the federal pot. So those are local park bonds, park measures, tax levies, a whole number of different opportunities that you'll find in a park budget, an open space budget, a wildlife budget, water quality budget, climate increasingly. In many places you won't see the word climate, but some you will. And so those opportunities are there to leverage. I was just going to provide one other example, which with the Quinault Indian Nation. So we've worked with them historically and on planning for their green spaces and conservation. We haven't actually been engaged as a partner in their relocation planning, but it's just an amazing, I think, example to look at. Many of you will be familiar with it, but if you're not, I would go take a look at their relocation master plan. It summarizes very well this long process that they've taken. It's interesting that it's a microcosm in a way, because they are a relocating community and a receiving community right next to each other, right? So they're talking about, well, what's going to happen to the lands we need to relocate away from? What's the community, the receiving community, going to be like that we're moving to? And parks, green space, open space are central to both of those conversations. Where are we going to have trail networks? Where can we engage with the coastlines and historic and cultural lands where they were previously settled? What will the park, the trail, the schoolyards, what will the systems of green space be like for the community we want to ensure that there is equity in parks and access and quality for the communities. So the last thing I'll mention in terms of the resource side of this is it's an excellent case study of tapping, using their own funds for sure, but also tapping EPA planning funding. There's a water system here, so EPA water assistance funding, right? Water infrastructure funding. They now have a relocation grant under the bipartisan infrastructure law. So leveraging various pots with a very thoughtful planning process that really centers the role of the public space and parks in their relocation. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brendan. Thank you for sharing that case study. And I also love seeing how the funds for conservation, so much of it is coming from state and local sources. Okay, so I will hand this over to Joanna, and yeah, you're on.
Hi everyone, does it look okay? You can see my screen fine? Okay, great. I hope I don't freeze at some point. Just flag me if I do. But hi everyone. Thank you so much to the Urban Ocean Lab and the organizers at Columbia Climate School for having me. Learning so much from this panel and really eager to get into the discussion. But as was mentioned, I wear two hats. My name's Joanna Lavecchio. I am both a part of the Climigration Network. I co-chair the Funding and Resources Working Group through the network. I'm also Director of Program Design for Climate Action at the Columbia Climate School. So we're a number of different hats, but more or less representing the First through Climigration Network and talking about some of the resources that are beyond just funding that we're working on as a network that I might offer everyone here to consider as a part of the landscape. So as has been sort of framed in amazing and thorough and rigorous ways by the previous speakers before me, we clearly have a climate relocation, climigration problem here in the US. And I'd also just echo that as a part of my other role at the climate school, this is not one that is isolated or in a vacuum as it relates to the United States. We don't sort of exist in a singular boundary of the US. And I have the privilege of working with communities all around the world where a lot of these challenges are also echoed and where lessons might be learned as well outside of the US context alone. And that some of the forces that drive climate relocation or climigration are international in scope as well. So some bigger questions there to consider beyond the scope of this panel. But here in the US, right, we have to act now. This is not a future looking problem. By 2045, more than 300,000 homes and $100 billion worth of property value will be at risk, and millions of lives will be changed as a result of that. And as we've heard from previous speakers, current adaptation programs in many ways can tend to reproduce some of the systemic disparities, particularly for BIPOC communities that created risk in the first place. So risk itself is not an existential thing, but that which has been created and constructed in many ways through policy. So a lot of the process that we're in is about unwinding some of that and correcting for that in future processes. And as we've heard over and over, communities face barriers to accessing federal resources through codified policies or practices like Louise was describing about benefit cost analyses that tend to favor certain types of solutions or types of communities or scales of projects even. And this really does a disservice to all of us as it relates to the outcomes through some of these projects. And I'd offer that this is where we might start to imagine the opportunities or what's needed or how to organize ourselves in support of these challenges, particularly as it relates to supporting tribal and community leaders around the US as they make really, really difficult decisions around adaptation in place, site expansion, or relocation, community-driven relocation entirely, and how we might show up to support that self-determination and decision-making with structures that increase access to information, planning tools and decisions, and even dialogue itself. We've heard also a lot about communities and their right to have solutions that really honor and align with culture, historic lifeways, needs, and visions that create better pathways in the future. So that's a lot of what we're working with and grappling with through the Climate Migration Network. So far, it's 100+ members that form the Climate Migration Network, bringing lived and learned experience to develop transformative community-led approaches to relocation. The network is a national scale. We have members who are from every corner of the US, and each of which bring different lenses that they apply to this dilemma and set of questions, from policy and legal constraints and governance to planning, research, communications, and even narrative building. The network's goal is to support and train practitioner members on one hand in their own role and positionality and oftentimes privilege, and to embrace that role in partners in supportive community and tribal climate initiatives, with a theory of change or assumption that the practitioner space is not well equipped or well supported even in showing up to these types of difficult conversations with the integrity, the compassion, empathy, and grounding in what systemically caused this challenge in the first place, to appropriately and with integrity show up to these conversations and the work ahead. As well, a diverse council informs the network's strategies with leaders from communities and tribes responding to the climate crisis, as well as a field of leaders in practice and science. And to just share a little bit about how the network is set up, there are a set of Indigenous leaders and community leaders who are working together on a number of different programmatic efforts. One is a small grants program, which I'll talk about later in the presentation, and also work together on communities of practice and shared learning in that space. And we also have a network of member working groups. So these are a set of working groups that meet typically about once a month and commit time on a volunteer basis primarily on a number of different themes or lenses, and produce programs, training, curriculum, orientations, events that center on some of these core challenges like funding and resources, which I'm a part of, ecosystems and people, research, policy and law, welcoming communities, and learning, programming, and events. The Network Council is a body of where those two pieces sort of meet and come together, where there is representation from across the network that helps really shape and guide the structure, function, offerings, and priorities of the Climate Migration Network overall. None of this would be possible without funders and advisors that support the network, as well as supportive operational staff of the network itself. Fearless leadership of Kristen Marcel and Maggie Ostu. So I'm not sure if they're on the call, but huge shout out to them. And the organization itself is hosted by the Consensus Building Institute. So there has been a sort of series of formational events since 2015 that has shaped the work plan, products, and learnings of the Climate Migration Network, and exemplify this path or journey, if you will, around connecting lived and learned experience in order to support and generate equitable, just community-led approaches to relocation. So network was formed in 2015 to 2019. And one of the major core deliverables, initial core deliverables of the network, was a Lead with Listening guide, which is a guidebook for community conversations on climate migration. I'll put the link to that in the chat so that others can access it. An ongoing work on community-led solutions project, which is teaming with the Anthropocene Alliance, buy-in community partners, and community-based organizations to develop community-led flood risk solutions. Innovations and Buyouts workshops, which my colleague Carrie Hewlett led in 2022, thinking about synthesizing some of the recommendations around and improvements to buyouts for program recipients and practitioners. Continuing work on leader dialogue, so establishing communities of practice with Indigenous and community leaders, so that kind of left side of the diagram that I shared. And of course, the Next Step Cohort Design Program, which is a participatory grant program for communities exploring or implementing relocation themselves. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. And this has been rigorously expanded in the previous presentations, but as we're talking about like what exists beyond the scope of federal commitments as it relates to this space, just want to put like the big wrapper around what some of the context is that we're working within and some of the problem definition that we're working on through the Funding and Resources Working Group at Climigration. So just for context, for every $100 that FEMA has spent to rebuild properties through NFIP, $1.72 is spent to help move people to higher ground. And it's estimated that $5 billion will be needed over the next 50 years to address tribal relocation infrastructure needs and climate impacts. Of course, this does not consider all communities that have been marginalized or are most vulnerable to these impacts, but gives a sense of the scale. It's also important, and one thing we're grappling with is that this also does not account for historic or repetitive losses that have been incurred. So this is like a current status, right? But it does not, if we're putting on our climate justice lens, this doesn't account for that which may have been lost or may be owed compensation for past forced relocation or movement of people, or the historic injustice that comes with having been moved to a risky place in the first place, not under your own agency. So just want to make sure we pause whenever we see statistics like this and ensure that we consider that as a part of the context. And recent commitments, as we've heard, $2.6 billion just announced through NOAA for coastal resilience, and $390 million of that will go to tribal priorities, and $720 million for programs dedicated to tribal land and native communities. Louise put in the chat some examples of the recent commitments to community-driven relocation or grants programs for community planning processes, particularly for tribal lands. These are important examples and important earmarks that are in these recent commitments at the federal level. But as we're talking about like beyond buyouts, right? I think it's a moment to think about some of the structural imperatives beyond federal funding alone and some of the other systems that are at play when we think about funding and resourcing of some of this work. So things that we're thinking a lot about at Climigration are how private and philanthropic sources and systems are often geared towards outputs and not outcomes. So this is like kind of a fundamental legacy of the type of economic system that we operate in. So when we think about grant making, how might we consider that? Also misaligned incentives, right, between practitioners, academia, and private industry that make it hard to justify certain actions or align resources even between, the way that an academic might get funding and the timelines or incentives related to that to support research, and the rapidity or urgency of the problem itself or flexibility with which funding might be needed to respond to a dynamic environment. We've talked a lot about already, previous speakers have talked a lot about siloed funding stream priorities and taxonomies. Brendan, you shared a way that we can start to think about deconstructing those taxonomies. Something that's for parks may also be useful for resilience and benefits that are beyond just our sort of 20th century view of what a park does. So I think that's an important piece that's starting to break down. Persisting focuses on single hazard-based and disaster responses. One term I recently learned about was the term Uztec, which is an indigenous term that that signals a catastrophic land collapse that is wholly interdependent and itself a new hazard. So when we start to think about the realities of how ecosystems work, but we've reduced the correlation to funding from, say, it's eligible from erosion, or it's eligible because of its risk to sea level rise or rainwater. We're not really honoring the way that landscapes and ecologies really operate. And also, finally, buyout funding typically ends at the buyout. Erica, I loved your graphic at the beginning. I think if we could think about ways of funding that align with the realities of landscape or a section drawing like that, we might avoid a lot of unintended consequences of some of these types of projects. For example, that we don't create a vacuum for private development, or we don't create a situation where there's no resources for funding restoration or stewardship of land that's left behind. To also just put into context, and I'm talking, I know, a lot about tribal and indigenous communities, but to give a little bit more context about the philanthropic landscape in this space, less than 0.5% of large foundation grant making allocations go to Native communities. This is since 2006. And according to the Investing in Native Communities Project, even less allocated to Native-led and Native service organizations. And as an example of some of the structural barriers, I think we're all used to seeing in demographic surveys or census materials or of surveys of any kind, right, this othering category, which is often even said that, right, within demographic data sources, regularly considered to be statistically insignificant, which is really a structural challenge as it relates to things like climate risk, and when we think about service to the most vulnerable, and the integrity with which relocation strategies are given, and the risk of repeating past harms. So a little bit about the Funding and Resources Working Group, which I co-chair. To date, we've led fundraising efforts to support the network operation, so standing up the network itself, and building a team to support tribal leaders to connect with philanthropic funders and fill gaps left by inadequate resources. So really like doing that relationship building and relationship cultivation between the tribal and community leaders and philanthropists who are interested in this type of investing, and as well as supporting small grants programs for community-led exploration of options. And this year, we're focusing on a number of different activities and have just expanded the working group. If you're interested in joining a work group, I'll share the resources for that after, toward the end of the presentation. But some of the things that we're working on and need support with, frankly, are funding for phase 2 of the next step of the cohort, which is the small grants program. We're also working on developing a system for matchmaking communities and tribal leaders with the network practitioners themselves. So to date, these things have been kept relatively separate and mediated by that council and the network staff themselves in an operational way, but trying to think about how to facilitate and matchmaking both the skills that exist in the practitioner or member work groups network and community and tribal leaders to connect those in spaces that have integrity and are safe and empathic for some of these difficult challenges to come to the surface. We're continuing problem statement definition and analysis continually to get more rigorous around how we define some of these problems, and working on translation of federal and philanthropic opportunities to climate migration context through things like policy briefs. We're also working on a partnership ethic. So what does it mean to be a good partner in this space, and who are the types of partners that we're looking for, particularly as it relates to philanthropy and government partners. And we're mapping network resources and opportunities for partnership and collaboration to bring a greater degree of transparency to what exists in the network itself. Talk a little bit about the Next Step cohort program, which is a participatory grant making and peer learning program established by Climigration. Between 2022 and 2023 was launched as a new peer learning system. 3 adaptation practitioner members and 4 frontline community and indigenous leaders are a part of it and facilitated by the network. And as a means of design, about 10 community leaders at a time could at any point be a part of the cohort. And the idea is that it's self-determined, place and culturally specific next steps along community relocation journeys. So the the allocation of resources that they decide or design for in the small grants program are fully self-determined and co-designed by the cohort, and it's sort of whatever comes first. The idea or the next step that is determined by a cohort member, and then the allocation of flexible resources to support that idea. A little bit more about how the small grants program works. They have monthly cohort meetings. Network members contribute to projects, grow their practice, co-conspire with community leaders and on systems change. And ideally, right, when we're working like a well-oiled machine, the network leverages its resources to access public-private funds to support future next steps that leverage the funding that's already in the program. And the funds are used, as I mentioned, and allocated by cohort members themselves. There's a pool of project funds available and used as a shared gifting model amongst them. And they receive tailored grants for their community's next step as self-determined by themselves. Just to get a little bit of an example of the typologies of programs and projects that are coming out, or the next steps, if you will. One, for example, might be used for supplementing relocation costs for low-income households who have already applied for federal buyouts and are continuing to engage residents in developing risk reduction solutions. Another type might be something like community organizing grants for planning conversations amongst neighbors and with local and state officials, as well as building year-over-year survey methodologies and data gathering at the local and community level to inform decision-making in the future. And I guess I'll just put this out there as one of the things that we're looking for and what it takes to run a program like this. The idea is that this would be a sustained program over the next 3 years to support some of these types of spaces for these community projects to emerge. And any sort of philanthropic giving would be towards a 40% of a pooled project funds that would be allocated by cohort members. As you might imagine, this takes a pretty special type of relationship, right, for a philanthropy or government to loosen what it might mean or how it might amend its definition of success as it relates to funding allocations, such as one like this. It's way more outcome and way more flexible than a metric-based or output-driven approach that's predetermined, say, before a grant is made. I'll offer, as I wrap up, some opportunities to learn more. You can always reach out to me, but for sure, check out the Lead with Listening guidebook that was developed by the Climigration Network and partners. You can always go to the website and get involved. If a working group resonates with you, always write in and happy to share more. And then, of course, find us on LinkedIn. Without much great gratitude, appreciation, and thanks to the many partners that are a part of this. I am certainly not alone in this effort. And of course, to Urban Ocean Lab and Climate School for having me.
Great. Thank you so much. Those were all amazing presentations. I've been learning so much throughout all these conversations that we've been having, and I'm really excited. There's a lot of questions in the chat. I also have some of my own questions and realize that we only have 10 minutes, so I'll do my best to prioritize. And so I guess the first thing is something common across all your presentations that was mentioned and that people also asked about were around the limitations of cost-benefit analysis. And I know that some of you are also eager to chat about that. So, anybody can answer, but could you share more about the challenges you've found or limitations in federally funded programs and the cost-benefit analysis in pursuing buyouts in areas that are experiencing tidal flooding and what these challenges mean for your program? I'll just open it up to just the general challenges with the cost benefit analysis, right? In every aspect of relocation.
I guess I can start. I think I had brought it up a little bit in my presentation, and it's something we probably could talk about for an hour, but in summary, a few of the things that we've seen years ago is that the benefits that are calculated really are looking at it through a federal lens And at a local level, we were finding that some of the more frequent flood events that maybe weren't high dollar events were truly impacting people's property and their ability to recover quickly. You know, when you call them kind of carpet wedding events, that they really impacted people's quality of life. They affected our emergency response services and our need to go out and pull people out on, you know, on boats, even if the water maybe wasn't in their, you know, in their house very deep at all. It was affecting things like, you know, sheds floating away and things like that. And so we just felt like some of those things, a lot of those things are not captured in the benefit cost number. In more recent years, I think there have been some revelations in terms of equity related to the benefit costs, and some of the lower value homes weren't meeting the benefit cost, having a positive benefit cost ratio. I think mainly because the lower you know, damage that was being done in theory to a lower building value, but yet you know, these folks are impacted and they're displaced, et cetera. So those are just two quick highlights that we found in it when we've been working on it for a long time.
Yeah, I want to build on what Tim, you were saying, and totally agree with those observations too. In terms of that last element, like areas that have historically been disinvested in, with, like, you know, housing property values that are lower, like it's not the same as calculating the avoided losses or the kinds of, you know, benefits that you can accrue from, you know, doing any kind of intervention. And so in New York City, you know, where we see some of this difference starkly is some of the like more residential and lower income communities in the outer boroughs often don't like have good benefit cost ratios. And then when you look at like the financial district, where you've got, you know, Wall Street and lots of commercial real estate, and I'm not making a judgment as to whether one should be better protected than the other here, but more just to say the benefit cost analysis process pushes you to have higher benefit cost ratios for the things that we have already put value into. And so there's like a real equity disparity there. The other thing I wanted to add, people have been talking about many different sources of federal funding. In theory, that's great to cobble them together. In practice, it can actually be really difficult to mix and match federal sources, because sometimes they have different eligibility criteria. Sometimes there's actually things written into grant programs called duplication of program, if you want to get real, you know, technical about it, but where it prevents you from using adding federal grants to something that you already have a federal grant for. So for instance, the vast majority of our bipartisan infrastructure money is transportation. There's so much money there. It can actually be really difficult to pair resiliency things on top of federal highway money, because there is this like duplication of program requirement where you can't layer those monies on top of each other. So it's not impossible all the time, but it can actually just be really challenging. So it sounds nice in practice, but doesn't always work out. And also just generally our programs prioritize homeowners and not tenants. And so really want to make that, you know, highlight that need.
I actually have a follow-up question for Brendan. You know, you're in the field of conservation, and I think there's fear that the conversion of tax generating land to a public park can raise concerns around the loss of local revenue. But Trust for Public Land has been doing work to quantify what are some of those ecological and economic benefits of conservation. And I'm just curious, you know, those impacts aren't always taken into the consideration for the cost benefit analysis and what happens to the land afterwards. So could you talk more about just those benefits and, you know, how that information actually supports the success of obtaining public funds for restoration?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that question, and I failed to highlight that in my talk. That yeah, we have you know, folks, economists, colleagues of mine on board. Matter of fact, they've recently done an analysis of sort of the benefits of park system in New York City, the benefits of parks in the, you know, Cleveland metro area, or statewide benefits of parks, and it's some of those are more easily quantified. You know, perhaps changes in property values, things that are very, very measurable. Others are less so. You know, improved tracking health benefits, you know, the value of community health benefits, the value of other broader social benefits. So you can do that, and these studies build on sort of the latest economics, the latest science to do that. But I mean, just in general, to the question, the main point of the question is, yes, we should be doing that, right? Because it's another example of benefits to a community that are not in the same silo, they're not in the same budget line item as, let's say, you know, that a buyout program might be. So taking a more comprehensive approach to sort of holistic community benefits. It's not always easy, but it is, I think, a really important direction to be moving to understand, you know, and plan more comprehensively.
Thank you. And since we have limited time, I also want to direct a question to Joanna. I think it's really interesting, you know, this concept of using philanthropic sources to address some of those additional needs, or not additional, but needs that communities have that aren't covered by buyouts. There's a question here. Could you give an example of a project funding expense in the next step cohort? And are they only focused on buyouts? And I also have a follow-up question after that.
Yeah, it's certainly not focused only on buyouts. So Climigration is supporting communities with decision-making process, right? So that decision might be to adapt in place, which, as we've heard, is more difficult for low income or less dense rural communities, in part because of how benefit cost analysis are all set up. It does not gather the return on investment, for example. So helping some of that upstream decision making, right, to adapt in place, to expand one site, or to move altogether. So this is not limited to the context of a buyout. That said, there's one example of or sort of type of project that could emerge and is emerging around supplementing those relocation costs. So in the case where low-income folks have applied for federal funding for buyouts themselves to gap fill for some of that which isn't covered. So that might be a use. Another use might be in the money and resources that it takes to continue to engage residents in conversations around risk reduction of the site. So that might be like workshops and convenings. That might be analysis for risk assessment that hasn't previously been transparent or accessible, or framed in such a way that a community or residents might be able to translate that into a set of decisions that are ahead. So that's another type of use I imagine could come out of the cohort. There's also uses that are for that community organizing and planning for some of these conversations. And as I mentioned, another use might be some of the data collection and surveying that's needed to catalog and document some of the community needs and realities of this issue on the ground. All of that takes money, planning, and time, is a huge resource that is not often afforded to the lowest capacity communities, who often, you know, wear many, many hats as leaders in a community. So thinking about how to open up capacity or institutionalize capacity in those organizations to run the meetings and apply for the grants and do the work of this planning work is another use that might come out of the next step cohort.
Awesome. Thank you. And we are also at time. I'm sorry we didn't have more time to address everybody's questions, but I'll keep track of them. And this panel is recorded. We will publish it online for those who are asking for it. And we'll see if we have opportunities for the panelists to be able to answer your questions in some other format. But yes, I would just like to thank all four of you today for just sharing all your knowledge and expertise. It was so rich to hear about these different opportunities that we have to advance not only the funding landscape, but the ways in which we practice climate-driven relocation. So with that, I'll hand it over to Radley just for a quick closing comment.
And I want to extend on behalf of the Climate School, thanks to you as well, Erica, for a fantastic panel. We really enjoyed it. I'll be real quick and just say that, remind folks, the official conference kicks off next Tuesday. High up in the chat, you can find a link if you haven't registered yet. And also please consider tuning in at 12:30 Eastern time this Friday for the second of our 2 pre-event webinars. This was obviously the first. That one's going to be focused on visual art and art more generally, and it has the intriguing title, Pastoral Follies and Lived Wisdom. So with that, we can close. Thank you all very much for attending. Bye.